In those early days, when we all were getting to know each other, the three of us would sit and talk for hours over cups of tea, sometimes long into the night. And of course, I was dazzled. I'd never met anyone like Howard in my life. He would talk about all these people and events, and he would tell us his ideas, and I'd sit there amazed.
Oh, I turned the volume on the radio to loud. I didn't want to miss a single word. Did you know morality was Eddie's favorite subject?
Really?
Yes, he loves to talk about it. He finds it so enjoyable. Well, you know, morality for Eddie is like, what? Like what? Oh, you know, it's like some terribly worthy old urn that's wrapped up in some towels in his back closet. Well, it's got a few chips in it, one has to admit, and it is rather ugly, really, if you bother to look at it, and it's too heavy to lift, and in its style, of course, it's totally out of keeping with everything else in the house, so, well, you know, it can't be used. It has no function in his life at all. But 10 times a day he has to exclaim, "Oh, yes, that urn, it's my great possession, my greatest treasure."
Oh, now, Howard,
Now,
really?
for Tom, of course, it's all just a wonderful way of being able to say at every opportunity, "Well, I was superior." You know, Tom is really indifferent to other human beings. You could be dying in agony in front of his eyes, and it wouldn't bother Tom the slightest bit. But he loves morality because it means he can say these other people were terrible. You know, what they did was wrong. They were inferior, contemptible. I, on the other hand, did what was right, you see, and I'm quite superior.
Father's best piece of prose, I've always thought, was his essay called The Enemy. You know, no one can actually write like that if they're over 25 for whatever reason. And he most certainly never could have. It was all so bluntly personal. The way he wrote about his parents, the house, the corridors, the statues, the sheer lustfulness with which he described the young woman whom he'd met in the park, the rather wild humor in his description of the process of bringing her over to the house, and then the power of that passage in which he slowly realizes who and what that young woman actually was. In the end, well, the hours he spent with her that night would change his life.
But now, I mean, really, Howard, when you speak of Tom, don't you think Tom was a bit superior? I mean, he did do certain courageous things at certain crucial moments, you know, in comparison to someone like Martin.
Oh, really? In comparison to someone like Martin, do you think?
Well, what Martin did was very, very cowardly. Tom spoke out, and Martin just kept quiet and tried to protect himself.
But you see, there you're judging another human being, aren't you, Jack?
Well, yes.
That's the thing that doesn't make sense to me. Because you're saying, in effect, that Tom behaved the way he should have behaved, but Martin didn't. Martin ought to have behaved differently from the way he did behave. So you're implying what? That you think that you would have behaved differently if you had been Martin?
No, I don't say I would have. I mean, maybe I would have. I don't know, but that's not the point.
It isn't?
No, I'm simply saying that Martin might have acted in a better way.
No, but you see, that's where I become incredibly confused because, I mean, if you were Martin, or if someone were Martin and they'd had Martin's life and Martin's experiences, then why wouldn't they perceive the whole situation around them in exactly the way that Martin did and act accordingly? And in that case, what's the point of condemning Martin since he couldn't help being what he was? And since he was what he was, he saw things the way he saw them and he did what he did. I mean, you're putting your energy into praising people or blaming people and saying who is better and worse, and meanwhile your attention is entirely turned away from the human suffering that is going on all around you and from the extremely difficult, hard-to-answer question of what's bringing it about. I mean, rather than condemning Martin or whomever, wouldn't it be more valuable to try and understand various things? For example, to understand what circumstances in the world or in a person's life might lead them to behave the way Martin behaved. What are these circumstances which come up in the world and lead to that? And how do they come up? I mean, all the judging, all the condemning, who's superior, who's inferior, I was right, and so on, are not terribly helpful to all the people who might actually be falling victim to every sort of horror while you're taking the time to debate these things.
I've always loved the way Father wrote in that essay about the people he called the dirt eaters, the people who eat dirt, and the ones like this strange young woman who rise up from the dirt to lead them. Love and desire, as so often happens, led him to new ideas, a new understanding. He felt suddenly connected to the poor of our country, and even to the rebels who fought on their behalf. He shows us in the essay the very moments at which erotic attraction gently wove in his heart a bond of sympathy with the poor, which turned out, strangely, never to weaken. And I love the way he described the young woman as she sat there, perched on his parents' sofa. 10 years later, you couldn't have found such a person anywhere, no matter how hard you looked. Drinking
her tea from my grandmother's cup, yellow with flowers, her hands nicked in 100 places. She answered my questions politely, quietly, but even speaking softly, her voice was hard, like wire twisting carefully around the simple words she spoke. How could someone like me even begin to understand the life she lived? No safety, no hope, no shelter, no trees, a completely flat landscape going on forever, running from the light, but the light was everywhere. When it rained, they were beaten into the ground. They had nowhere to go, lying in the mud. We've been wandering like this for actually years, she said, her beautiful skin, even her face, burned, scratched, like the field she'd slept in.
For whatever reason, he was born like that, he had this odd ability, a quirky ability for someone from that background. He could read the face of anyone, effortlessly read it, and see the intelligence in it. So from an early age, he was always wondering why were certain people, the ones not from his background, systematically made to eat dirt and kept so far away from the songs of Schubert.
After she left, alone in my bedroom, lying on the floor, I frightened myself by how much I cried. So this was the enemy, and all I wanted in the world was to help her. I said out loud, I'll do anything, anything. But as soon as the words were out of my mouth, I was trembling with fear, like the blind girl in the fairy tale.
People think I was fascinated by Howard's writing, that I'd always been some sort of admirer of Howard. That's simply absurd. You know, I was a confused young man. I was wandering around some vaguely expensive clothing store one afternoon with a group of people. I was trying to buy a pair of pajamas, and along came Judy, also shopping, and someone introduced us, and that thing happened, you know, where people use that rather terrifying expression, their eyes locked. And then Judy left, but I kept having this rather vivid fantasy that she and I were both trying on pajamas, and I was sort of taking off my clothes and wandering by mistake into her little booth. And then a few weeks later, I ran into her again, late at night, by the lake in the park, in that little alley of trees where they used to hang those enormous paper lanterns. And eventually she brought me over to the house, and I met Howard. I met him, we talked, we got along fine. But my God, I was never tempted for a single minute to become a disciple of Howard. I was an observer at best, even on a very good day. A very good day. A vague hanger-on was the most I ever would have called myself if I would have called myself anything.